The morning my fence became a scandal, I was standing on the back deck of my cabin sipping coffee and watching a black bear pace the tree line. Too curious for comfort, too close for coincidence, and definitely not something you want sneaking into a neighborhood where the loudest voice belongs to an HOA president named Karen, with more bark than sense. That bear, silent and powerful, reminded me exactly why I built the fence 8 feet tall. Reinforced wood, motion-triggered lights, and absolutely necessary in a region where bear sightings had jumped 30% in the last 2 years. But Karen? Karen didn't care about data, safety, or the fact that her trash bins were practically buffet tables for wildlife. All she saw was a structure she hadn't approved, and what followed was a crusade of petty tyranny I didn't see coming. Before I dive into how this drama spiraled out of control and why the bear became the least of our problems, let me ask you to take a second, subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because what you're about to read isn't just HOA madness. Survival, revenge, and justice rolled into one. Now, it started when I moved to Aspen Ridge. That's HOA speak for don't mess up the aesthetic Karen personally curated. I bought my log cabin near the woods for peace and quiet, not to wage war over fence heights. But the bear sightings changed everything. One had already gotten into my neighbor's garage, tearing through a freezer and leaving claw marks on their Subaru. The HOA responded by sending out a flyer. Do not leave out food. Report sightings to Karen. That's it. So I built my fence. No one complained. In fact, 2 neighbors thanked me, saying it made them feel safer. Then Karen saw it. She came stomping down my driveway in wedge sandals, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown of entitlement. This fence violates Section 14C, she snapped before even saying hello. I asked her what Section 14C was. She said, no fence shall exceed 6 feet in height or obstruct natural views. I explained calmly that the fence only faced the wooded side, where the view was trees and more trees, and it was there because of repeated bear activity. Her answer? Then maybe you shouldn't live in bear country. I tried to be diplomatic. I showed her the wildlife reports, even offered to lower the fence by a foot if it would help her ease her concerns. But Karen didn't want compromise. She wanted control. That was followed by a second warning 3 days later, and then a scheduled HOA board hearing. I laughed, hearing over a fence, but it wasn't funny. The hearing wasn't just a warning. It was a full-blown ambush. Karen had stacked the room with friends from the HOA board, most of whom didn't even live on my street. They called my fence disruptive, unsightly, and aggressive. The only aggressive thing about that fence was how it protected Karen's own backyard from being a bear corridor. I tried again to reason with them, this time showing photos of bear tracks, time-stamped videos from my trail cams, and a printed copy of the wildlife report from the county. One of the board members, a guy named Bryce, with too much hair gel and not enough common sense, asked, "Have you considered bear spray instead?" That's when I realized I wasn't just dealing with ignorance, I was dealing with pride. Karen didn't want a safer neighborhood. She wanted obedience. The board voted unanimously. The fence had to come down within 14 days or face a $500 a day fine. I appealed the decision. They rejected it. I filed a formal complaint with the county. Karen responded by delivering a cease and desist for harassment. Meanwhile, the bears didn't stop coming. One night, I caught a big male circling the trash bins 2 doors down. I sent the footage to the board. No reply. I printed the images and dropped them in Karen's mailbox. The next morning, animal control officers were parked outside, but not for the bear for me. Karen had reported me for aggressive behavior, claiming I was weaponizing wildlife imagery to intimidate HOA members. You can't make this up. Officers quickly realized she was exaggerating, but it was clear Karen wasn't done. I went back to work on the fence, reinforcing it, improving the lighting, even adding a second layer of chicken wire at the base to deter climbing critters. That week, a neighbor named Leela stopped by with brownies. "I just wanted to say thanks for keeping the fence up," she said. "I feel safer." I appreciated it, but told her it might not last. Karen had now scheduled a demolition inspection. She intended to bring contractors to remove the fence if I didn't comply, and that's when something incredible happened. A bear actually showed up in Karen's backyard. It happened at dusk. I was in my yard, sipping tea, watching the tree line. When I saw it, a young black bear, sniffing its way toward the row of townhomes that backed onto the woods. Karen's house was the closest. I tried calling her, no answer. I ran down the street knocking on her door. Still no answer. Her lights were on, so I assumed she was home, but I saw the trash bins. They were open. At them, I didn't have time to debate. I ran back to my yard, grabbed my air horn, and sprinted across the yards like a maniac, blasting the horn to scare it off. It worked. The bear scattered back into the woods, but not before leaving a path of knocked-over bins and claw marks on Karen's fence. She emerged 10 minutes later, robe on, furious. "What were you doing in my yard?" she shouted. I pointed at the mess, saving you from exactly what that fence was meant to prevent. She didn't thank me. She threatened to call the cops. But the bear scare rattled her more than she let on. The next morning, the HOA hearing was canceled. No explanation. The demolition notice. Postponed pending further review. I wasn't celebrating yet, but something had shifted. 2 days later, I found an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a handwritten note. "We may need to revisit the wildlife risk issue." "Perhaps we were too hasty," signed Karen. No apology, of course, but a crack in the armor. And I wasn't done yet. Karen's note didn't fool me. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. And if I had learned anything from my time in corporate law before retiring to this quiet mountain community, it was that people like her never admit fault, they reposition. Her signature on that note was less a peace offering and more a trapdoor. And I knew the moment I received it that the HOA drama was far from over. But I also knew something she didn't. I had started documenting everything. Every meeting. Letter. Every wild accusation. And now I had something better: surveillance footage of the bear attack on her property. Plus my air horn intervention, all recorded on my smart cams. That footage was timestamped HD and backed up to both my cloud storage and 2 external drives. I didn't want to use it against her. But if she came at me again, I'd be ready. Over the next week, I noticed a change in the tone of the HOA. There were no more paper violations taped to my door. Karen stopped walking her dog past my property. And I overheard from a neighbor that she had told the board she was taking a step back to focus on self-care. That would have been the end of it. But then the real bomb dropped. 10 anonymous email hit my inbox with the subject, "HOA documents you should see." No return address, no signature. But attached were scanned PDFs of internal HOA communications, vote records, and, most damningly, a proposal drafted by Karen 2 months before the fence drama even began. It outlined a property view initiative, where homes along the woodland perimeter line included would be cleared of obstructive structures. To restore the natural visual unity of the community. It wasn't about the fence. It had never been about the fence. It was about gentrification. Karen wanted to convert the rustic edge homes into modern units, increase property values, and sell off the aesthetic outliers, as she called them. My cabin, with its solar panels, compost bins, and towering bear-proof fence, was target number 1. Furious but focused, I printed every page of that email and began preparing a case. If Karen wanted a war, I was ready for one. But before I could act, fate handed me a gift. Another bear sighting, this time in broad daylight, and once again in Karen's yard. The bear had grown bolder since the first encounter. This time, it climbed onto her deck, tore through a screen door, and reportedly got halfway into her kitchen before being scared off by her own dog's barking. Animal control came. The local news picked up the story, and Karen found herself. The unwitting face of a wildlife risk report featured on the evening broadcast. And guess what footage they used? Mine. I had submitted it to the station anonymously, and they ran the full clip. The bear's approach, the trash bins, the air horn rescue, all of it. Karen didn't appear on camera, but her house was unmistakable. The fallout was immediate. Several homeowners emailed the HOA demanding a review of wildlife safety policies. The board scheduled an emergency meeting. Karen, now publicly humiliated and privately furious, sent out a defensive newsletter titled "Setting the Record Straight." where she blamed the bear encounter on unsecured trash due to a malfunctioning lid and subtly accused unnamed neighbors me of exploiting the situation for personal vindication. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my oatmeal. But I wasn't laughing when 2 days later, a new violation notice appeared, this time from the county. According to the letter, my fence now violated a zoning ordinance updated just 1 week earlier. It reduced the maximum fence height for residential properties adjacent to undeveloped woodland from 8 feet to 6. It was clearly a targeted change. I checked the county website and saw the amendment had been submitted by a local zoning advisor who also happened to be Karen's cousin. The level of manipulation was staggering. I called the zoning office, filed an appeal, and while I waited for the red tape to churn, I did what I do best. I investigated. Late that night, I pulled property records, committee affiliations, donation logs, anything I could get that connected Karen's HOA power trip to local officials. The deeper I dug, the more corruption I found. Karen had ties to 3 zoning officials, 2 contractors who had bid on view restoration work, and 1 city council member whose re-election campaign she had supported with community PAC funds gathered from HOA dues. It wasn't just petty power tripping, it was organized exploitation. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to write a formal complaint to the state's HOA Oversight Commission, attach the anonymous email, and request an emergency audit. One submitted everything through a contact I had from my legal days, a friend who now worked in state enforcement. I didn't hear anything for 3 days. Then, all at once, everything started to unravel. First, a notice went out to the entire community that the HOA was under temporary review, and all enforcement actions were suspended pending investigation. Then, one by one, homeowners began sharing their own stories, fines, threats, demands to modernize, and sudden zoning notices, eerily similar to mine. Turns out I wasn't the only one targeted. I was just the first to fight back. That weekend, we had a community meeting, an unofficial one, on the lawn outside Lila's house. Almost 30 people showed up. They brought copies of letters, screenshots of emails. And one brave woman brought a voice recording of Karen, threatening to make life hell for any homeowner who resisted the beautification plan. The tide had turned. A petition started circulating calling for Karen's resignation and a full forensic audit of HOA finances. I stayed quiet mostly, letting others share. I didn't need credit. I needed results, and results came fast. Oversight Commission sent investigators to Aspen Ridge the following Monday. They interviewed residents, subpoenaed HOA financials, and questioned Karen for nearly 6 hours. The next day, she resigned. No statement, no apology. Just a one-line email to the board. Effective immediately, I stepped down as HOA president. Her allies followed within days. The board was gutted. In their place, a transitional committee formed, one that included me, Lila, and 3 other longtime residents. Our first act? We passed an emergency measure to suspend all HOA rules related to fencing, pending a complete review. My fence stayed up, and we added another clause. Any structure built for verified wildlife safety was exempt from visual harmony requirements. In short, I won. But more than that, the neighborhood woke up. People stopped hiding. They started talking. And for the first time since I moved to Aspen Ridge, the HOA felt like a community organization, not a control mechanism. I went to bed that night feeling more peace than I had in months, knowing that the battle over a fence had protected not just property but people. The aftermath of Karen's downfall was more complicated than I expected. And while her resignation sent a ripple of relief across the neighborhood, it didn't take long before the cracks she left behind began to show. We discovered that the HOA's finances had been more than just questionable. They were dangerously close to fraudulent. Lila and I, along with the transitional committee, began reviewing every expense report, contractor invoice, and reimbursement record the HOA had filed in the past 2 years, and what we found made our stomachs turn. Karen had approved nearly $78,000 in landscaping expenses from a company that didn't seem to exist beyond a P.O. box in a neighboring town. Even worse, There were nearly a dozen reimbursements to herself labeled as event planning fees. Each one conveniently just under the threshold that required board vote approval. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became that Karen hadn't just been power-hungry, she'd been treating the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Word spread quickly, and so did the outrage. What had started as a fence dispute now became a full-on financial scandal that pulled in state investigators, local reporters, and even a segment on a consumer rights TV program that dubbed our story "The Fence That Brought Down a Queen." I couldn't walk down the street without someone thanking me, offering baked goods, or asking how they could help. But amid the celebration and committee meetings, something began to nag at me. Bear, or rather the increasing boldness of the bears. There had been 5 sightings in the past 3 weeks alone, including one where a mother and 2 cubs were spotted pawing through a recycling bin behind the community center. It wasn't just Karen's property that was at risk anymore. Whole neighborhood had become a bear buffet, and now that we were all talking to each other more openly, it became clear just how unprepared most residents were to handle it. So I proposed a new initiative, not to tear anything down, but to build something better. A wildlife safety coalition funded by redirected HOA dues and staffed by volunteers trained in bear deterrence, trash security, and neighborhood awareness. The response was overwhelmingly positive. We got 20 sign-ups the first night, and by the end of the week, we had set up a rotating patrol schedule. Bear-proof trash bins were being installed, and Marcus, a retired wildlife officer who lived on the corner, offered to run free safety seminars. The place started to feel like a real community for the first time. But just when I thought we were finally turning a corner, Karen made a reappearance. Not in persons. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found a letter from a law firm with her name at the top. She was suing me for defamation of character and property value sabotage, alleging that my fence, my footage, and my public role in the committee had caused her emotional distress and economic harm. I stared at the letter, stunned not by the claim itself. It was absurd, but by the sheer audacity of it. The woman who tried to destroy my peace, who abused power and put everyone in danger, was now crying victim because I'd stood my ground. I contacted my own lawyer, a friend from my legal days named Carla, who read the letter, chuckled, and said, "This is posturing, but if she files, we'll make her wish she hadn't." I had evidence, community backing, and the moral high ground, but that didn't stop Karen from escalating. She went on local radio, spinning a tale about community aggression, painting herself as a misunderstood reformer who was run out of town by a mob. She even posted a series of videos online showing old photos of the neighborhood before and after her rule, claiming she had beautified a wilderness, but the community wasn't buying it. The comments were brutal. One of her videos had over 700 replies, most of them from residents calling her out, some even posting their own footage of her berating them, others reminding everyone of the financial records now under review by the state. Her last video ended with her saying she was leaving the area for personal healing. And just like that, the shadow she'd cast over Aspen Ridge lifted for good. But her lawsuit? That one didn't go away. It dragged on for weeks, a nuisance. More than a threat, but one I had to treat seriously. We counterfiled with a cease and desist for harassment, included affidavits from 12 residents, and submitted all the financial discrepancies to the court. In the end, Karen didn't show up to her own hearing. Her case was dismissed, and we were granted legal protection from further contact. But the ordeal left a bitter taste, not because I lost anything, but because of how icily one person's obsession with control had nearly unraveled an entire community. Still, we pressed forward. The fence stayed. The bears, though still present, began avoiding our area thanks to the newly enforced trash regulations and nightly patrols, and our committee evolved into something larger, a full neighborhood council with rotating leadership, open voting, and transparent budgeting. I no longer had to fear what might show up on my doorstep, be it a bear or a bogus violation notice. I even started sleeping with the windows open again, trusting that my fence and my neighbors had my back. Lila, now a close friend, suggested we throw a fence freedom block party to celebrate the HOA's transformation. We decorated my fence with string lights, served barbecue, and shared stories of the past year with laughter instead of stress. Kids ran around safely. Gave a demo on how to scare off bears with air horns and citronella spray. And when the sun dipped below the trees, we lit a bonfire and toasted not just to winning against Karen, to reclaiming the peace we all moved here for in the first place. But there was still one thing left to do. One loose end. I'd kept the anonymous email that started everything, the one with the leaked HOA documents, and I always wondered who sent it. I never mentioned it during the investigations, partly out of instinct, partly because I wanted to see if the truth would surface naturally. Then, one quiet afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was a soft knock, hesitant, and when I opened it, I found Dorothy, one of the oldest residents in the neighborhood. She looked nervous, holding a small manila folder in her hand. "I think you should have this," she said, handing it over. Inside were printed emails, the originals of the ones I'd received digitally. I couldn't stand what she was doing. She said, "I've been here 40 years. This place wasn't always like this. And when you stood up, I realized maybe it could go back to the way it was meant to be." I hugged her, and for the first time since this whole thing began, I felt the kind of peace no fence could provide. It was community, and this time it was real. After Dorothy left that afternoon, I sat for a long time on my porch, staring out at the forest that bordered my property. The same forest Karen once called a visual nuisance. It was peaceful, that kind of silence that lets your thoughts drift instead of churn, and I thought about how close I came to selling this place, packing up and leaving behind a life I built with my own hands just to escape the kind of war no one warns you about, kind that comes with paper trails instead of fists, threats wrapped in neighborhood newsletters, and smiling faces, hiding agendas sharp enough to draw blood. And yet as I sat there sipping coffee, the air filled with pine and the occasional chirp of a bird, I realized something crucial. I hadn't just won. I had survived a test of values in a world where civility is often just camouflage for control. And now, it was time to do something with that victory. I started with outreach. Not just to neighbors I already knew, but to ones who had kept to themselves during Karen's reign, either from fear or fatigue. I went door to door with Leela, introducing ourselves not as committee members, but as neighbors who wanted to rebuild trust, one cup of coffee at a time. We didn't ask for anything, we just listened. Some people were hesitant at first, others opened up immediately. And as we made our way through the streets of Aspen Ridge, it became clear that Karen's presence had created more scars than we realized. There were stories of harassment, of families forced into early sales, of elderly residents fined so aggressively they'd had to borrow money just to stay in their homes. One man named Greg showed us a binder full of letters from the HOA, all signed by Karen, all citing nonsense like excessive garage noise or seasonal foliage misalignment. He'd tried to fight them but never had the support. "I thought I was alone," he said, and I realized that was the real poison Karen had spread division. So we did the opposite. We created community dinners, rotating each week at a different home. We set up a free repair exchange where people could post things they needed help with, and others could volunteer their skills. Marcus led a Saturday morning safety class that became so popular, it got its own waiting list. Slowly the vibe in Aspen Ridge shifted from paranoid compliance to actual camaraderie. It was beautiful. But just as everything seemed to be settling, nature reminded us that the wild doesn't care about community timelines. Another bear appeared. This time, not just near Karen's old house, came through the center of the neighborhood in the middle of the day, sniffing around bird feeders, pacing curiously near parked cars. A teenager captured a video of it on his phone, and within hours, it went viral locally. The press returned, this time with questions not about HOA disputes, but about wildlife encroachment. Suddenly the narrative shifted. Aspen Ridge was no longer just the neighborhood that overthrew its tyrant HOA. It was now the neighborhood surrounded by bold bears. Reporters wanted to know what we were doing about it, what policies were in place, and how residents could stay safe. And just like that, our wildlife coalition became the centerpiece of a regional conversation. I found myself in meetings with state conservation officers, urban planning officials, even a few wildlife biologists who were writing studies on suburban bear behavior. What we learned changed everything. The bear population wasn't just growing, it was adapting to climate changes and reduced natural food sources. Bears were beginning to associate human dwellings with easy access to calories trash, pet food, compost, even birdseed. The solution wasn't fences alone. It was education, community awareness, infrastructure support. So we pivoted again. Our committee secured a grant from the state's environmental agency to distribute bear-proof trash cans to every household. We created laminated guides with bear deterrence tips and distributed them with magnets so residents could stick them on their refrigerators. Marcus organized a simulation event where volunteers dressed in bear costumes to show kids how to respond if they ever saw one near the house. And all the while, I kept thinking how none of it would have happened if Karen had simply let that fence be. One structure, one sensible solution, had sparked a wildfire of change that transformed our entire community. And now that change was rippling outward. Other neighborhoods reached out. HOA presidents from nearby communities asked for advice, templates, and stories about how we organized after corruption. Lila even got invited to speak at a housing ethics conference. Aspen Ridge became a model not for perfection, but for what happens when people stop letting fear and silence run their lives. Still, Karen's ghost lingered in small ways. Some of her former board allies tried to sow doubt during meetings, questioning expenditures, proposing red tape for community events. But now, the rest of the neighborhood was awake. They shot down bad faith proposals with logic and laughter. We had minutes, had transparency, and we had each other. One evening, I was locking up my tool shed when I spotted headlights crawling down the road toward my property. It was unusual that late, and I stepped onto the porch just in time to see a black SUV stop at the edge of my driveway. The window rolled down Karen. I hadn't seen her in months. In the pale moonlight, she looked like a shadow of her former self, hair less styled, eyes sunken, no smug smile. Just a tired, pale face and a slight nod. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Then she reached into the passenger seat.
Ow!
Pulled out an envelope and set it gently on the dashboard before driving away without another word. I waited until her taillights disappeared, then walked to the edge of the drive and retrieved it. Inside was a check reimbursement for all the legal fees I'd incurred during her lawsuit, plus a brief handwritten note. You were right about the bears. That was it. No apology, no plea for forgiveness. It's acknowledgement, finally, that the thing she had fought so hard against was the very thing that had kept her safe. I didn't cash the check. I donated it to the state's Wildlife Protection Fund in Karen's name. Because in some strange way, her war against my fence had become the very catalyst for saving our neighborhood, not just from her control, but from ignorance, from apathy, from forgetting that we live not just next to nature, but within it. And maybe, just maybe, she realized that too. After I donated Karen's check in her name, I didn't expect to hear from her again. For the most part, I didn't. But her exit didn't mean the end of our responsibilities. It was just the end of one chapter. The fence, once a source of contention, now stood not only as a symbol of boundary and protection, but as a kind of rallying monument. Neighbors stopped by often to ask questions, admire its sturdiness, or share updates on bear sightings. It felt surreal that something so ordinary, a few planks of treated pine and a secure gate, had become a line between tyranny and trust, ignorance and preparedness. But the real test of everything we'd built came that fall, right as the air started to shift and the trees turned into pillars of amber and rust. The bears hadn't left. In fact, they were more active than ever, preparing for the winter, raiding wherever they could, and growing increasingly bold. One morning, I woke up to find fresh paw prints by my back deck. Deep and heavy, along with shredded trash near my neighbor Emily's shed, the safety coalition immediately responded, updating our patrol routes and even calling in the local wildlife officer to give us an emergency briefing. That's when we learned something that shook the group more than anything else had since Karen's reign. This was no longer about protecting ourselves from random visits. The bear population had shifted its path entirely. Aspen Ridge now sat directly in the center of their most traveled route toward a nearby river. We weren't just near their territory anymore, we were in it. That realization changed our tone completely. The coalition went from community hobby to full-scale wildlife response unit. We established perimeter zones, with each household responsible for certain prevention protocols, secured bins, clean yards, motion sensors. Marcus brought in contacts from his conservation days, and soon we were training people to read bear signs, scat, claw marks, food patterns. Local wildlife experts held info nights in the community center. And yet, despite all that effort, it wasn't enough to stop what happened next. The Petersons lived near the western ridge, right where the slope met the thickest part of the woods. Their property had always been vulnerable, and one night while out walking their dog, Janet Peterson came face to face with a black bear. She did everything right, stood tall, didn't run, made herself big, but the bear had already caught scent of something in her bag, and it lunged. Her scream echoed through the ridge, and if Marcus hadn't been nearby doing a perimeter check, we might have lost her. Scared the bear off with an air horn and flashlights, but not before Janet suffered deep scratches to her arm and back. She was rushed to the hospital, and though she recovered, the trauma rippled through the neighborhood like a dropped stone in still water. The attack was a wake-up call we hadn't wanted but couldn't ignore. Held an emergency meeting that next day, every resident showed up. It's time I didn't speak from notes or refer to procedures. I stood in front of the crowd in the same room where Karen used to gavel people into silence, and I told them the truth. We live in a wild place, I said, and wild things don't follow our rules. They don't care about fences or fines or power struggles, but they do respect preparedness. And if we're going to stay here, we need to be more than a community. We need to be a team. It wasn't a speech meant to inspire. It was a plea, and it worked. The coalition expanded into 3 tiers: patrol, prevention, and emergency. Response. We assigned radios, created text alert systems, and even installed a central communication board at the entrance of the neighborhood. Emily suggested we invite the local high school's ecology club to help, and their involvement brought a level of tech-savvy innovation we hadn't considered. They installed thermal cameras and created a basic app where people could report sightings in real time. The teens took to it with surprising enthusiasm, and before long, the Ridge Bear Watch was functioning better than most small-town emergency systems. But with increased visibility came attention we didn't necessarily want. Media crews returned. They weren't interested in Karen this time. They wanted footage of bears. Interviews with residents, shots of my fence, Marcus's patrol team, the app, the alerts, the drama. At first, we welcomed it, thinking that more awareness might help other neighborhoods, but the coverage twisted quickly. One segment used ominous music and dubbed our community the neighborhood on the brink. Another showed night footage of a bear in someone's driveway, edited to look like an attack. Suddenly, we weren't the success story. We were a spectacle. Tourists began driving through the area, hoping to see a bear. Some even left food out. On purpose. It was chaos. Lila, who had become our unofficial liaison to media, finally called for a complete press blackout. No more interviews, no more footage, just action. We doubled our efforts, not just to keep the bears away, but to take back control of the narrative. It wasn't about drama, it was about survival. And that meant we needed help. Real help. Marcus? And I drove into town and requested a meeting with the county wildlife department. We presented our records video footage, attack logs, prevention plans, even photos of Karen's old policies that left us vulnerable. To our surprise, they took us seriously. A month later, we were granted a partnership status, giving us access to county-funded bear deterrent systems fencing upgrades, motion-activated lights, educational programs, and with that support, the situation began to stabilize. No more attacks, no more reckless tourists, just steady, cooperative effort. The Petersons moved out, deciding city life was safer, but they left a thank you note on my porch, along with a small wooden carving of a bear and the words for the man who stood his ground etched into the base. I kept it on my mantle. It's not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the wildest threat isn't the one with claws, it's the one with a clipboard Karen may have gone, but her legacy had forced us to confront something deeper. Nature isn't optional here. It's part of us, whether we want it to be or not. And fighting it with rules and rigidity only leads to disaster. I walked the perimeter. Every evening now, checking cameras, updating logs, greeting neighbors, and every time I passed the fence, I smiled. Because while it may have started as a way to keep something out, it had grown into something much more. It was the beginning of something bigger than me, bigger than any one homeowner. It was the line that reminded us who we were and who we refused to become again. Winter approached quickly after the county's support kicked in, and the air turned crisp with a kind of quiet that settled over Aspen Ridge like a thick wool blanket. The bears had retreated deeper into the forest to hibernate, and for the first time in months, there was a collective breath of relief across the neighborhood. But instead of letting that relief turn into complacency, we used it as an opportunity to solidify the new systems we had built. Every committee that had been hastily formed in response to Karen's collapse was now formalized. With rotating leadership, accountability logs, and monthly reports, the Wildlife Coalition evolved into a permanent bear-safe neighborhood task. Forson Marcus was appointed as its lead advisor. Local rangers attended our meetings, and the Ecology Club from the high school continued to support with their app updates and drone surveillance, which now helped monitor not only wildlife, but potential wildfire risks as well. With nature somewhat tamed and the HOA's grip dismantled, our neighborhood shifted into a new identity. No longer a place defined by fines and fear, but by shared responsibility. People smiled more. Neighbors stopped to chat instead of rushing. Inside, the fences we once used to divide were now built with the intent to protect everyone. But peace, I had learned, was always temporary. One morning, just before sunrise, I found a large envelope taped to my front door. No return address. Inside were a series of aerial photographs, drone shots of my backyard, my tool shed, and even one of me walking toward the woods. The angles were too precise to be casual, and the timestamps revealed they had been taken just days earlier. There was no message, just one word scrawled across the back of the last image in red marker. Why? It rattled me more than I expected. Not because of the surveillance. I had cameras of my own and knew the signs, but because of the intent behind it. This wasn't curiosity. This was a warning. I showed the photos to Marcus, who immediately initiated a full sweep of the property. He found a hidden trail cam tucked behind a tree near the southeast fence, its battery still warm. Whoever had been watching us wasn't finished. We traced the serial number and identified it as a model favored by private investigators and journalists. I suspected the latter. After the media blackout, a few reporters had continued sniffing around, hungry for a follow-up to the HOA downfall and bear saga. One, in particular, has been especially persistent, a woman named Dana Triggs, who'd published an op-ed titled "The Wild Within." Aspen Ridge's struggle between man and beast. It had painted us as an unstable enclave of self-styled vigilantes. I called her directly and confronted her. She denied any recent involvement and claimed her editor had moved her onto other assignments. But something in her voice felt off, forced. I asked Marcus to check if any of the major news outlets had filed public records requests about our community. Within hours, we found several. Someone was digging, possibly preparing a hit piece or worse, trying to frame us as a community out of control. The timing couldn't have been worse. With winter settling in and bear activity declining, the urgency of our precautions would be harder to defend without fresh incidents. We were at risk of being recast, not as a success story, but as overreactive survivalists clinging to a drama. That had passed. I knew it needed to be done. Transparency. If they were going to tell a story, we'd give them the real one. I invited a small group of local reporters, ones we trusted, to attend an open forum in our community center. We presented everything: our safety data, wildlife logs, education initiatives, the app, the task force logs, and even the photos I'd received. We made our case calmly, factually, with nothing to hide, and to our surprise, it worked. Anew. Wave of articles emerged, this time portraying Aspen Ridge as a model of resilience and cooperation. The narrative shifted once more, this time solidifying us as a case study in effective grassroots response to overlapping crises. But that wasn't the end. A week later, I received a package from the county. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at the Regional HOA Reform Summit, an annual gathering of homeowner association leaders, legal experts, and community advocates. They wanted me to tell our story, not just the conflict with Karen, but what came after. I was reluctant. I wasn't a public speaker. I was just a man who built a fence. But Marcus encouraged me. "Dad," he said, "that fence started everything. Turned a neighborhood back into a community. People need to hear that." So I went, and I told our story. About how a single complaint about a too-tall fence spiraled into a reckoning. About how power can rot from the inside when left unchecked. About how we stopped fighting each other and started fighting for each other. The response was overwhelming. People approached me afterward in tears, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Some had faced lawsuits over bird feeders. Others were fined for planting the wrong color of flowers. One man told me his daughter wasn't allowed to park her car in their driveway because it had a college bumper sticker. They were hungry for change. I gave them what I could: copies of our bylaws, samples of our community framework, advice about how to mobilize. And then I returned home, tired but hopeful. Aspen Ridge had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of persistence. A reminder that, even when surrounded by bureaucracy and wilderness, people could choose compassion over control, cooperation over fear. As I drove back through the gates, I passed the fence once more. Snow was just beginning to collect on its top rails, softening its lines, making it look almost like part of the landscape. A neighbor's child had tied a red ribbon to one of the posts. I didn't know why, but I left it there. Maybe it meant nothing. Or maybe it was just another quiet reminder that something meant to divide could also connect.
A winter would come.
Hard this year, we could feel it in the air, but we were ready. Not because of fences or rules or enforcement, but because we had each other's backs. And that was something no HOA, no bear, no outsider with a drone could ever take from us. The snow deepened quickly that winter, blanketing every trail, rooftop, and fallen leaf beneath a soft, quiet white. Aspen Ridge looked like a postcard, the kind of place you'd imagine sipping cocoa by the fire while the world outside faded into peaceful stillness. But beneath that quiet lay a network of watchful eyes, organized routines, and an unspoken readiness that had become second nature. Our community had evolved. We weren't just homeowners anymore. We were caretakers of something larger than ourselves. Our routines remained tight. Patrols were adapted for snow conditions. Emergency kits were upgraded for power outages. The app the teens had developed was now in use by 3 other neighborhoods across the region. And every time someone asked me if it was all worth it, I pointed to the fence, the very fence Karen once tried to tear down. Because that fence didn't just keep out bears. It had revealed the fault lines in our community, forced us to confront what we valued, and ultimately brought us closer than any HOA policy ever could. But Karen wasn't entirely gone, not really. Every now and then, someone would forward me screenshots from a blog she'd started, The Truth About Aspen Ridge. It was a rambling mess of conspiracy theories, complaints, and passive-aggressive swipes at everyone from me to the wildlife rangers. She accused us of violating property rights, harboring militia energy, even being involved in wildlife trafficking. I laughed the first time I saw it, but then came the anonymous emails, long venomous paragraphs accusing us of corruption, of turning Aspen Ridge into a wilderness cult, and vowing to expose what we'd done. Marcus traced them to a proxy server, likely someone Karen had hired or convinced to continue her crusade. We reported them, of course, but the message was clear. She wasn't done trying to reclaim the narrative. Still, it didn't matter, because the real story wasn't something she could touch. It lived in every neighbor who looked out their window and saw a community stronger than ever. In the child who now played safely in the snow without fear of wild animals, in the local ranger who used our model to train new volunteers, and in the quiet man who built a fence and found himself leading a movement. One cold evening I got A knock on the door. It was Emily, holding a small box. "Thought you'd want to see this," she said, handing it over. Inside was a brass plaque, engraved and polished, "To the man who built the wall that brought us together." I didn't know what to say. I'd never wanted attention. I just didn't want someone else to get hurt because one woman couldn't see past her own rules. But the plaque wasn't about me. It was about all of us. It was about the people who had stood up, stayed strong, and stepped forward when the world expected us to retreat. That weekend, we mounted it on the fence, right near the front gate. Not to brag, but to remember. That same night, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long orange shadows over the snow, Marcus and I stood near the ridge, looking down toward the trees. "They'll wake up soon," he said, referring to the bears. I replied. "But this time, so will we." He smiled, and for a long moment, we just listened to the stillness. Not because we feared what might come from the forest, but because we respected it, understood it, and were ready. And that's how one HOA Karen's petty obsession with a fence accidentally built the most resilient, united community in our state. If you've ever faced injustice from an HOA, or seen someone wield petty power against the people around them, no, this change doesn't always come from lawsuits or shouting matches. Sometimes it starts with a few nails, a hammer, and a deep belief in doing the right thing, even when it's not the easiest. Thank you for reading our full journey. If you want more stories like this about courage, justice, and standing your ground, make sure to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel. We've got more truth, drama, and real victory to share. You won't want to miss what's coming next.